Thank you for inviting me here today and to try and explain some of the issues facing British migrants living in Spain and the EU. Before I start, I would like to apologise in advance if my voice, you can maybe hear it, gives out a bit or I need to pause for a drink. I've got a horrendous virus I came back with from the US with last week and I'm still struggling with. So firstly, I'll introduce myself. I'm a British migrant living in Spain for 14 years. I'm Vice Chair of Bremain in Spain, and I'm on the board of directors of European Movement UK. I'm also on the committee of the National Rejoin March and co-host their podcast with Peter Core. Before we get into the issues, I think it's worthwhile explaining a little bit about Bremain in Spain and our work. So Bremain is the only European Movement UK group outside the UK and was set up in 2016, just after the referendum. Some of you may know that our chair, Sue Wilson, was the main plaintiff in the legal challenge Wilson versus Theresa May, the Prime Minister of the time. And that case argued that illegal Russian interference, criminal overspending by Vote Leave, and the criminal investigation into Arron Banks undermined the integrity of the referendum result and tried to render that decision void. The case obviously failed because here we are, mainly because it was deemed out of time, but the ruling was that the referendum and its outcome must be treated as lawful, even though it was only advisory, and even though there were proven electoral and criminal law breaches. If referendums were legally binding, it would have been annulled. We also work very closely with the British ambassador and his team at the Madrid embassy, particularly over the transition period, where we fed the issues our members were experienced due to their change of status and new requirements back to the embassy. So then they in turn could liaise with the Spanish and UK authorities to try and ease the problems and advise agencies on the ground. We also regularly submit oral evidence and written evidence to parliamentary select committees on Europe, representation and voting rights. In 2021, we were shocked to learn that Sue was awarded, under Boris Johnson's pro-Brexit government, an MBE for services to British in Spain and Europe, signed off by Dominic Raab of all people. We are pretty sure how that happened and how that came about, but I don't want to get anyone into trouble. And anyway, we feel it was very well deserved. A true patriot there. So the first point I'd like to raise, I suppose, is our lack of political representation and disenfranchisement. There are around 1.2 million of us officially registered across the EU. Firstly, it's worth noting that we don't get to vote in European Parliament elections or national elections in our host nation. In most nations, we do get to vote in our local elections only. So prior to the most recent UK general election, British abroad were only allowed to vote for 15 years in UK elections after they'd left the country. Bremain and many others campaigned strongly for years for the UK government to remove this limit to ensure we were properly represented. And it was actually Boris Johnson, yet again, who did so in his electoral reform bill. And so now, British abroad, no matter how long they've been out of the country, have the opportunity to vote. Now, some people think that's unfair, but many of us pay taxes in the UK and voting is the right of every citizen enshrined in the Declaration of Human Rights. And while we may live abroad, both domestic and foreign policy choices our government makes can have profound impacts on its citizens everywhere. For example, Brexit or something like the triple lock on pension. However, the current voting system for Brits abroad is unfit for purpose. It's no use having the right to vote if the system for exercising that right doesn't work. Tens of thousands of British citizens' votes across the EU did not count at the last election, mainly because ballots can only be made ready around 3 weeks before, and in some constituencies it's even less than that. We can't download ballots, we can't vote at embassies like others can, and we must rely on post or proxy. Since Brexit, our post has become even slower and more unreliable. Our research and testimonies we gathered from dozens of our members showed that very few, if any, who tried to vote by post managed to do so, with a vast amount of ballot papers arriving after the election. We recently gave these testimonies and recommendations, again, as evidence to the House of Commons Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Select Committee. So I dread to think how the Australian and American and British contingency fared, but until changes are made, voting rights for British abroad remain almost unfit for purpose. There is also, excuse me, little to no help on the ground in our host nations if there are issues with our status, paperwork, or legal issues outside of the odd charity or paying for legal assistance or lawyers. It's actually our own UK constituency MPs who are our point of call if things go wrong, but they have very little knowledge of the issues we face. And the embassy, unless you're in an emergency situation, aren't there to help either. So we are currently working with Unlock Democracy, the New Europeans, Lib Dems Abroad and others on a campaign for dedicated MPs for overseas constituencies, similar to what several other countries have, including France, which has an excellent system we would love to have replicated. We feel an MP for British in Europe, for example, would give us far better representation and understanding of the issues we face. Nearly 1 in 9 Brits live abroad, and so it's worth their while chasing our votes too. Now, the deepest and the most complex issues we face are down to our change of status to third country nationals. These issues run deep and are literally, in some cases, tearing families apart. Those of us who took up our right as European citizens to live in an EU country pre-referendum thought those rights were indelible and lifelong. We made huge life decisions based on that. We married other Europeans. We could work across borders, living in one country and working in others. Some of us had children in mixed European families, which was never an issue when we were all European citizens, and treated equally across all member nations. Now, if you have, say, a Spanish or another European partner or spouse, things can be very difficult. Say you're a British national who wants to return to the UK with a Spanish spouse. You now have to meet minimum income requirements of £29,000 a year and obtain a visa. Half of all workers in the UK earn under that amount and more in Spain. If you have children, the requirement is an extra £3,800 for the first child, £2,400 for each child after. So that's £35,000 for a family with 2 kids wanting to go back to the UK. So you can see how difficult that could be. For, say, a pension-age mixed family or a family on one average income, it's impossible. So this means that some British nationals, even if they wanted to go home, back to live in the UK, which many Brits do eventually, they just can't anymore, unless they're willing to break up their relationship or family. And we know British nationals who wish to return to the UK, but the requirements now make that choice impossible because of their family situation. Also, Brexit has made it much harder for families to care for elderly or sick relatives, including Brits who want to come to the EU to look after a relative and vice versa. There is a family reunification visa, which was negotiated under the withdrawal agreement, but it's incredibly restrictive. It covers spouses and dependents under 18 or adult dependents, maybe like a disabled adult child or maybe a grandparent if you could prove you were responsible for them financially and their care. But even this has high minimum income requirements and it's, again, very, very difficult to use. I once wrote an article about a lovely lady called Margot. She lived in Spain for over 25 years. She had a small stroke and her daughter Vanessa wanted to come look after her mum in Spain. She quickly ran out of her 180 days allowance and had to leave Spain and her mum in the care of neighbours. She then returned and at great expense and much hoop jumping went through lawyers and the authorities, first getting visa extensions, then trying to get residency rights, but she just couldn't quite meet the threshold, even though she thought her and her mum had enough to live on. Margot lived in a lovely community, she had great neighbours and she really did not want to go back to the UK. But in the end, Vanessa had no choice but to take her mum back. Now, knowing that, of course, would be much worse for Margot's health, mental and physical, and more expensive with the cost of living being much higher. Last time I caught up with her 2 years later, she's still in the UK trying to find a way back to Spain with her mum. Now, pre-Brexit, Vanessa would have moved over, registered at her town hall where she lived. She could have worked if she wanted to. If she had enough money, she didn't have to work, as long as she could get her own healthcare. That's just, and this is really one of thousands of stories that work both ways, as it was very common in previous years for people to come and live with their relatives when they got sick. Something many people don't understand as well, that we too have lost our freedom of movement. So living and working in different or multiple countries in Europe is far more common than many think, particularly in Britain, as we're an island. And although for those of us living in the EU pre-Brexit, certain rights are enshrined in the withdrawal agreement, that does not allow us freedom of movement around the EU. We are still limited to 90 and 180 days outside our host nation. So, for example, one of Bremain's council members who lives in Mallorca and is married to a German who works and lives mainly in Germany, pre-Brexit, he spent significant time in both countries, coming and going as he pleases, working from Germany and then working from Spain. Post-Brexit, this led to issues regarding his 90, 180-day allowance. So to get around this and to regain his freedom of movement, he chose to become a Spanish citizen, which has become a more popular choice. However, it's not suitable for everyone. Many are not proficient enough in Spanish to sit the test, and Spain only allows dual nationality to a select few, mainly South American countries. So you are expected to give up and renounce your British citizenship, which can cause issues later down the line if you want to return to the UK. In fact, it may already be causing issues. You may have seen in the news recently about the ETA requirements for EU citizens to enter the UK. British citizens who also have an EU passport are required to use their UK passport to enter the UK and not their EU passport plus the ETA. But many dual citizens have let theirs expire or never had one, such as in the case of dual nationality children, who are now having to scramble to get one at considerable expense, much more than the £16 ETA fee. And in the case of Spain, it's even more complicated, as Spain doesn't allow dual nationality, and citizens are required to renounce their old nationality. So at the moment, they seem to be caught in a catch-22 situation of either A, applying for a British passport in breach of Spanish nationality rules, or B, use their EU passport and lie on the ETA form and say they don't hold a second nationality, which is an offence and could see them barred from the UK. It's a bit of a nightmare at the moment. We have raised this with the relevant UK authorities and the embassy and are awaiting guidance, but we feel it's just another thing they haven't thought about when it comes to dual nationality and Brits in Europe. Professional qualifications. This one has had profound impacts. Pre-Brexit, all UK professional qualifications were recognised across the EU and vice versa, but not now. As the UK is a third country, qualifications are recognised according to the rules of each individual EU and EEA country. Now, Labour has said they want a mutual recognition agreement, but for the moment, the only MRA the EU has with another country is an agreement with Canada granting semi-automatic recognition to architects. So we don't hold our breath for that one. Even if your qualification is recognised in your country you live in, or you want to move to, let's say take a TEFL certificate, which is Teach English as a Foreign Language, a really popular job for Brits in Europe due to our privileged position as native English speakers and the fact that people all over the world want to learn English. Now, in theory, you can still apply for a job, but via a work visa with minimum income and requirements, which differ slightly around the EU. In Spain, you would need a job to pay more than 28,000 a year and get a visa, which takes months and it's costly. However, to even qualify for a work permit, and this goes for any job, it must be proven that no suitably qualified EU or EEA national is available to fill that position. So on a shortlist as such. And why would any employer wait for months for someone to obtain a visa when there is a pool of people from 31 countries to draw from? For this reason, many Irish people are now taking jobs across Europe that Brits would have once done, and good for them. But this is just one more way in which Brexit has denied Brits the same opportunities and rights as our 450 million European neighbours. Not only that, just give a thought to the tens, if not hundreds of thousands of EU students who came to Britain to study over the years to get a good education, then to find out that qualification is now not recognised in their home or other EU nations. I mean, it's just frankly appalling. And much of this is to do with Boris Johnson rushing through the withdrawal agreement to get Brexit done. It just didn't cover everything it needed to do. So a lot of Brits too think the ending of freedom of movement only affected people who would want to move to Europe. But restricted mobility for British in Europe has had a terrible effect too. And raising awareness about it could help strengthen arguments around the benefits of freedom of movement and for rejoining. So the EU and UK governments' focus on the withdrawal agreement was EU citizens living in the UK and UK citizens living in the EU. However, it never took into account the impact of Brexit on highly mobile individuals like academics, musicians, second homeowners, people running businesses, people working for multinationals across multiple countries, or people just maintaining family ties. As I said, there are 1.2 million Brits registered living in the EU. However, from academic research, we know that prior to the end of the transition period, there were 2 to 3 times that number if you included non-documented migrants, cross-border workers, and second homeowners. That's between 2 and 3.6 million Brits who were highly mobile and using freedom of movement. All of those people's lives have changed now and are restricted. An example, my son, he lived here, grew up here, speaks Spanish and had permanent residency. He returned to the UK to do an apprenticeship and study. He's a mechanical engineer now, currently working on cruise ship refurbishments. Last year, he had to turn down work on a ship in Cadiz in Spain because he had done 2 short-term contracts there already and would have run over his 1,980 days. So cross-border EU working is no longer an option for him when it should be. He regularly notes that there are hardly any, if any, British contractors working on the vessels that people from all across Europe are. Next, I want to go to university fees. This one might come as a shock, but to learn that international university fees are now payable by UK nationals residing in the EU if our children want to go back to the UK to study, which of course many do. They're British. My daughter did. So it's not home fees, but international fees we now have to pay, which vary greatly, but can be around £28,000 per year and up to £60,000 for some medical degrees. And I actually met a British immigrant here in Spain who voted for Brexit and was enraged to find out that by the time her daughter went to uni, which was after there was a little period of time where they didn't come into effect, that she would have to pay international fees. And her words were, "I didn't vote for Brexit, so British people would be discriminated against." So like so many others, she didn't think that one through very well. And this may not seem like much of an issue, but it's really affected everyone: postal charges and customs and tax. So most British migrants maintain close relationships with their family in the UK, and being reasonably close is why many chose Europe over other countries. But the ability now to send birthday present, Christmas presents, books, calendars, or even documents has become a minefield. So pre-Brexit, just like posting something between Wales and Scotland, as long as you had the postage on it, you were fine. Now you need to fill out a detailed customs declaration, even for documents. You can't say it's a document. You've got to say what document it is, its value, its country of origin. If you're sending anything electronic like a phone, you've got to include a serial and IMEI number for mobile phones and things like that. Then you have no idea of the end costs. It's literally a minefield. In some areas like the Canaries, you have to do a digital declaration, even for very small value items. And the fact that everything has to be cleared via customs means delays of weeks or even more. Sometimes you don't even get the product. So Bremain used to sell our merchandise to fund ourselves. We had a shop. I have a warehouse in the UK with my business, and I used to stock all the merchandise there and post it out all over Europe when someone ordered a single item. We just can't do that now, and we've had to shut our shop down. So you can see how Brexit destroyed the businesses of like many online small sellers. We just can't send postal items anymore. So I would say, in conclusion, people who moved to other parts of the world outside the EU at least knew the rules of the game when they made those choices. And if you were lucky enough to be able to move now, you know the rules. They are restrictive, but at least you could make an informed decision. However, for us Brits living in the EU prior to Brexit, and likewise for EU nationals in the UK, these changes have brought life-changing consequences. Basically, Brexit has done two things. It has moved the goalposts for British people who moved to the EU prior to Brexit on the clear understanding that we would be able to go home one day with our partners and families, or have family members join us, or send our children to university back home, have onward freedom of movement and work across borders. Brexit changed all of that. Secondly, it has closed the door behind us, or pulled up the drawbridge. And despite all of the weaknesses of the withdrawal agreement, those of us who fall under it know that we are enormously fortunate that we were able to move when we did and put down roots, live, love, work and retire in our chosen country. It breaks our hearts that the same opportunities are now denied to other British citizens. Young people can no longer have a European adventure, working their way around Europe or studying abroad, meeting their future spouses, learning other cultures. And while British migrants or expats, as the BDL insists on referring to us, are often stereotyped, the truth is that pre-Brexit, Brits in Europe were as diverse as the four nations. Single mums, young, old, professionals, artists, musicians, rich, poor, but Brexit changed that. Now the dream of working in Europe or retiring to the sun after a lifetime of working is really only an option for the wealthy. That is the tragedy of Brexit. And while closer relations, alignment, deeper cooperation, and joining other EU agencies and programs is great and necessary, the only way for Brits to rightly have the same opportunities as we had and all our European neighbours have is to join the EU again as full members.